Chapter 3. For 15 years Haste had wandered, invariably courteous and unapproachable, and in return was generally considered a queer chap. He had started off on these travels of his after the death of his father, an expatriated Swede who died in London, dissatisfied with his country, and angry with all the world, which instinctively had rejected his wisdom. Thinker, stylist, and man of the world in his time, the elder Haste had begun by coveting all the joys, those of the great and those of the humble, those of the fools and those of the sages. For more than 60 years he had dragged on this painful earth of ours, the most weary, the most uneasy soul that civilization had ever fashioned to its ends of delusion and regret. One could not refuse him a measure of greatness, for he was unhappy in a way unknown to mediocre souls. His mother Haste had never known, but he kept his father's pale, distinguished face in affectionate memory. He remembered him mainly in an ample blue dressing gown in a large house of a quiet London suburb. For 3 years, after leaving school at the age of 18, he had lived with the elder Haste, who was then writing his last book. In this work, at the end of his life, he claimed for mankind that right to absolute moral and intellectual liberty, of which he no longer believed them worthy. 3 years of such companionship, at that plastic and impressionable age, were bound to leave in the boy a profound mistrust of life. The young man learned to reflect, which is a destructive process, a reckoning of the cost. It is not the clear-sighted who lead the world. Great achievements are accomplished in a blessed, warm mental fog, which the pitiless cold blasts of the father's analysis had blown away from the sun. "I'll thrift," Haste had said to himself deliberately. He did not mean intellectually, or sentimentally, or morally. He meant to drift altogether and literally, body and soul, like a detached leaf drifting in the wind currents under the immovable trees of a forest glade. To drift without ever catching on to anything. "This shall be my defence against life," he said to himself, with a sort of inward consciousness, that for the son of his father there was no other worthy alternative. He became a waif and stray, austerely from conviction, as some do through drink, from vice, from some weakness of character, with deliberation, as others do in despair. This, stripped of its facts, had been Haste's life up to that disturbing night. Next day, when he saw the girl called Alma, she managed to give him a glance of frank tenderness, quick as lightning, and leaving a profound impression, a secret touch on the heart. It was in the grounds of the hotel, about tiffin time, while the ladies of the orchestra were strolling back to their pavilion after rehearsal, or practice, or whatever they called their morning musical exercises in the hall. Haste, returning from the town, where he had discovered that there would be difficulties in the way of getting away at once, was crossing the compound, disappointed and worried. He had walked almost unwittingly into the straggling group of San Giacomo's performers. It was a shock to him, on coming out of his brown study, to find the girl so near to him, as if one waking suddenly should see the figure of his dream turned into flesh and blood. She did not raise her shapely head, but her glance was no dream thing. It was real, the most real impression of his detached existence, so far. Haste had not acknowledged it in any way, though it seemed to him impossible that its effect on him should not be visible to anyone who happened to be looking on. And there were several men on the veranda, steady customers of Schomberg's table d'hôte, gazing in his direction, at the ladies of the orchestra, in fact. Haste's dread arose, not out of shame or timidity, but from his fastidiousness. On getting amongst them, however, he noticed no signs of interest or astonishment in their faces, any more than if they had been blind men. Even Schomberg himself, who had to make way for him at the top of the stairs, was completely unperturbed, and continued the conversation he was carrying on with a client. Schomberg, indeed, had observed "that Swede" talking with the girl in the intervals. A crony of his had nudged him, and he had thought that it was so much the better. The silly fellow would keep everybody else off. He was rather pleased than otherwise, and watched them out of the corner of his eye with a malicious enjoyment of the situation, a sort of satanic glee, for he had little doubt of his personal fascination, and still less of his power to get hold of the girl, who seemed too ignorant to know how to help herself, and who was worse than friendless, since she had for some reason incurred the animosity of Mrs. San Giacomo, a woman with no conscience. The aversion she showed him, as far as she dared, for it is not always safe for the helpless to display the delicacy of their sentiments, Schomberg pardoned on the score of feminine conventional silliness. He had told Alma, as an argument, that she was a cleverer enough girl to see that she could do no better than to put her trust in a man of substance, in the prime of life, who knew his way about. But for the excited trembling of his voice, and the extraordinary way in which his eyes seemed to be starting out of his crimson hirsute countenance, such speeches had every character of calm, unselfish advice, which, after the manner of lovers, passed easily into sanguine plans for the future. "We'll soon get rid of the old woman," he whispered to her hurriedly, with panting ferocity. "Hang her! I've never cared for her. The climate doesn't suit her. I shall tell her to go to her people in Europe. She'll have to go, too. I will see to it. 1, 2, march! And then we shall sell this hotel and start another somewhere else." He assured her that he didn't care what he did for her sake, and it was true. 45 is the age of recklessness for many men, as if in defiance of the decay and death waiting with open arms in the sinister valley at the bottom of the inevitable hill. Her shrinking form, her downcast eyes when she had to listen to him, cornered at the end of an empty corridor, he regarded as signs of submission to the overpowering force of his will, the recognition of his personal fascinations. For every age is fed on illusions, lest men should renounce life early and the human race come to an end. It's easy to imagine Schomberg's humiliation, his shocked fury, when he discovered that the girl who had for weeks resisted his attacks, his prayers, and his fiercest protestations, had been snatched from under his nose by "that Swede," apparently without any trouble worth speaking of. He refused to believe the fact. He would have it at first that the Zangiacomos, for some unfathomable reason, had played him a scurvy trick, but when no further doubt was possible, he changed his view of haste. The despised Swede became for Schomberg the deepest, the most dangerous, the most hateful of scoundrels. He could not believe that the creature he had coveted with so much force and with so little effect was in reality tender, docile to her impulse, and had almost offered herself to haste without a sense of guilt, in a desire of safety, and from a profound need of placing her trust where her woman's instinct guided her ignorance. Nothing would serve Schomberg but that she must have been circumvented by some occult exercise of force or craft, by the laying of some subtle trap. His wounded vanity wondered ceaselessly at the means that Swede had employed to seduce her away from a man like him, Schomberg, as though those means were bound to have been extraordinary, unheard of, inconceivable. He slapped his forehead openly before his customers. He would sit brooding in silence, or else would burst out unexpectedly, declaiming against haste without measure, discretion, or prudence, with swollen features and an affectation of outraged virtue which could not have deceived the most childlike of moralists for a moment, and greatly amused his audience. It became a recognized entertainment to go and hear his abuse of haste, while sipping iced drinks on the veranda of the hotel. It was, in a manner, a more successful draw than the Zangiacomo concerts had ever been, intervals and all. There was never any difficulty in starting the performer off. Anybody could do it, by almost any distant allusion. As likely as not he would start his endless denunciations in the very billiard-room where Mrs. Schomberg sat, enthroned, as usual, swallowing her sobs, concealing her tortures of abject humiliation and terror under her stupid, set, everlasting grin, which, having been provided for her by nature, was an excellent mask, inasmuch as nothing, not even death itself perhaps, could tear it away. But nothing lasts in this world, at least without changing its physiognomy. So after a few weeks Schomberg regained his outward calm, as if his indignation had dried up within him. And it was time. He was becoming a bore with his inability to talk of anything else but Haste's unfitness to be at large, Haste's wickedness, his wiles, his astuteness, and his criminality. Schomberg no longer pretended to despise him. He could not have done it. After what had happened, he could not pretend, even to himself. But his bottled-up indignation was fermenting venomously. At the time of his immoderate loquacity, one of his customers, an elderly man, had remarked one evening, "If that ass keeps on like this, he'll end by going crazy." And this belief was less than half wrong. Schomberg had Haste on the brain. Even the unsatisfactory state of his affairs, which had never been so unpromising since he came out east directly after the Franco-Prussian War, he referred to some subtly noxious influence of haste. It seemed to him that he could never be himself again till he had got even with that artful Swede. He was ready to swear that haste had ruined his life. The girl so unfairly, craftily, basely decoyed away would have inspired him to success in a new start. Obviously Mrs. Schomburg, whom he terrified by savagely silent moods, combined with underhand poisoned glances, could give him no inspiration. He had grown generally neglectful, but with a partiality for reckless expedients, as if he did not care when and how his career as a hotel-keeper was to be brought to an end. This demoralized state accounted for what Davidson had observed on his last visit to the Schomburg establishment, some 2 months after Haste's secret departure with the girl to the solitude of Sumburen. The Schomburg of a few years ago, the Schomburg of the Bangkok days, for instance, when he started the first of his famed table d'hôte dinners, would never have risked anything of the sort. His genius ran to catering, white man for white men, and to the inventing, elaborating, and retailing of scandalous gossip with asinine unction and impudent delight. But now his mind was perverted by the pangs of wounded vanity and of thwarted passion. In this state of moral weakness, Schomburg allowed himself to be corrupted. Chapter 4. The business was done by a guest who arrived one fine morning by mailboat, immediately from Celebes, having boarded her in Macassar, but generally, Schomburg understood, up from China Seaway. A wanderer, clearly, even as Haste was, but not alone and of quite another kind. Schomburg, looking up from the stern sheets of his steam launch, which he used for boarding passenger ships on arrival, discovered a dark sunken stair plunging down on him over the rail of the first-class part of the deck. He was no great judge of physiognomy. Human beings, for him, were either the objects of scandalous gossip, or else recipients of narrow strips of paper with proper billheads stating the name of his hotel, W. Schomburg, proprietor, accounts settled weekly. So in the clean-shaven, extremely thin face hanging over the mailboat's rail, Schomburg saw only the face of a possible account. The steam launches of other hotels were also alongside, but he obtained the preference. "You are Mr. Schomburg, aren't you?" the face asked quite unexpectedly. "I am at your service," he answered from below, "for business is business, and its forms and formulas must be observed, even if one's manly bosom is tortured by that dull rage which succeeds the fury of baffled passion, like the glow of embers after a fierce blaze." Presently the possessor of the handsome but emaciated face was seated beside Schomburg in the stern sheets of the launch. His body was long and loose-jointed. His slender fingers, intertwined, clasped the leg resting on the knee, as he lolled back in a careless yet tense attitude. On the other side of Schomburg sat another passenger, who was introduced by the clean-shaven man as "my secretary. He must have the room next to mine." "We can manage that easily for you," Schomburg steered with dignity, staring straight ahead, but very much interested by these two promising accounts. Their belongings, a couple of large leather trunks browned by age, and a few smaller packages, were piled up in the bows. A third individual, a nondescript, hairy creature, had modestly made his way forward and had perched himself on the luggage. The lower part of his physiognomy was overdeveloped. His narrow and low forehead, unintelligently furrowed by horizontal wrinkles, surmounted wildly hirsute cheeks and a flat nose with wide baboon-like nostrils. There was something equivocal in the appearance of his shaggy, hair-smothered humanity. He, too, seemed to be a follower of the clean-shaven man, and apparently had travelled on deck with native passengers, sleeping under awnings. His broad, squat frame denoted great strength. Grasping the gunwales of the launch, he displayed a pair of remarkably long arms, terminating in thick, brown, hairy paws of simian aspect. "What shall we do with the fellow of mine?" the chief of the party asked Schomburg. "There must be a boarding-house somewhere near the port, some grog-shop where they could let him have a mat to sleep on." Schomburg said there was a place kept by a Portuguese half-caste. "A servant of yours?" he asked. "Well, he hangs on to me. He's an alligator hunter. I picked him up in Colombia, you know. Ever been in Colombia? No, said Schomburg, very much surprised. An alligator hunter? Funny trade. Are you coming from Colombia, then? Yes, but I've been coming for a long time. I come from a good many places. I'm travelling west, you see. For sport, perhaps, suggested Schomburg. Yes, sort of sport. What do you say to chasing the sun? I see. A gentleman at large, said Schomburg, watching a sailing canoe about to cross his bow, and ready to clear it by a touch of the helm. The other passenger made himself heard suddenly. Hang these native craft, they always get in the way. He was a muscular, short man with eyes that gleamed and blinked, a harsh voice, and a round, toneless, pock-marked face, ornamented by a thin, dishevelled moustache, sticking out quaintly under the tip of a rigid nose. Schomburg made the reflection that there was nothing secretarial about him. Both he and his long, lank principal wore the usual white suit of the tropics, cork helmets, pipe-clayed white shoes, all correct. The hairy, nondescript creature, perched on their luggage in the bow, had a check shirt and blue dungaree trousers. He gazed in their direction from forward in an expectant, animal-trained manner. You spoke to me first, said Schomburg in his manly tones. You were acquainted with my name. Where did you hear of me, gentlemen, may I ask? In Manila, answered the gentleman at large readily, from a man with whom I had a game of cards one evening in the Hotel Castile. What man? I've no friends in Manila that I know of, wondered Schomburg, with a severe frown. I can't tell you his name. I've clean forgotten it. But don't you worry. He was anything but a friend of yours. He called you all the names he could think of. He said you set a lot of scandal going about him once, somewhere in Bangkok, I think. Yes, that's it. You were running a table d'hôte in Bangkok at one time, weren't you? Schomburg, astonished by the turn of the information, could only throw out his chest more and exaggerate his austere lieutenant of the reserve manner. A table d'hôte? Yes, certainly. He always... for the sake of white men. And here in this place, too. Yes, in this place, too. That's all right, then. The stranger turned his black, cavernous, mesmerizing glance away from the bearded Schomburg, who sat gripping the brass tiller in a sweating palm. Many people in the evening at your place? Schomburg had recovered somewhat. 20 covers or so take one day with another, he answered feelingly, as befitted a subject on which he was sensitive. Ought to be more, if only people would see that it's for their own good. Precious little profit I get out of it. You are partial to table d'hôte, gentlemen? The new guest made answer that he liked a hotel where one could find some local people in the evening. It was infernally dull otherwise. The secretary, in sign of approval, emitted a grunt of astonishing ferocity, as if proposing to himself to eat the local people. All this sounded like a longish stay, thought Schomburg, satisfied under his grave air, till, remembering the girl snatched away from him by the last guest who had made a prolonged stay in his hotel, he ground his teeth so audibly that the other two looked at him in wonder. The momentary convulsion of his florid physiognomy seemed to strike them dumb. They exchanged a quick glance. Presently the clean-shaven man fired out another question in his curt, unceremonious manner. You have no women in your hotel, eh? Women? Schomburg exclaimed indignantly, but also as if a little frightened. What on earth do you mean by women? What women? As Mrs. Schomburg, of course, he added, suddenly appeased, with lofty indifference. If she knows how to keep her place, and it'll do. I can't stand women near me. They give me the horrors, declared the other. They're a perfect curse. During this outburst, the secretary wore a savage grin. The chief guest closed his sunken eyes, as if exhausted, and leaned the back of his head against the stanchion of the awning. In this pose, his long, feminine eyelashes were very noticeable, and his regular features, sharp line of the jaw, and well-cut chin were brought into prominence, giving him a used-up, weary, depraved distinction. He did not open his eyes till the steam launch touched the quay. Then he and the other man got ashore quickly, entered a carriage, and drove to the hotel, leaving Schomberg to look after their luggage and take care of their strange companion. The latter, looking more like a performing bear abandoned by his showman than a human being, followed all Schomberg's movements step by step, close behind his back, muttering to himself, in a language that sounded like some sort of uncouth Spanish. The hotel-keeper felt uncomfortable, till at last he got rid of him at an obscure den, where a very clean, portly Portuguese half-caste, standing serenely in the doorway, seemed to understand exactly how to deal with clients of every kind. He took from the creature the strapped bundle it had been hugging closely through all its peregrinations in that strange town, and cut short Schomberg's attempts at explanation by a most confident, "I comprehend very well, sir." "It's more than I do," thought Schomberg, going away, thankful at being relieved of the alligator hunter's company. He wondered what these fellows were, without being able to form a guess of sufficient probability. Their names he learnt that very day by direct inquiry. "To enter in my books," he explained, in his formal military manner, chest thrown out, beard very much in evidence. The shaven man, sprawling in a long chair with his air of withered youth, raised his eyes languidly. "My name? Oh, plain Mr. Jones. Put that down. A gentleman at large. And this is Ricardo." The pock-marked man, lying prostrate in another long chair, made a grimace, as if something had tickled the end of his nose, but did not come out of his supineness. "Martin Ricardo, secretary. You don't want any more of our history, do you? Eh? What? Occupation? Put down, tourists. We've been called harder names before now. It won't hurt our feelings. And that fellow of mine, where did you tuck him away? Oh, he'll be all right. When he wants anything, he'll take it. He's Peter, a citizen of Colombia. Peter, Pedro. I don't know that he ever had any other name. Pedro, alligator hunter. Oh, yes, I'll pay his board with the half-caste. Can't help myself. He's so confoundedly devoted to me that if I were to give him the sack he would fly at my throat. Shall I tell you how I killed his brother in the wilds of Colombia? Well, perhaps some other time. It's rather a long story. What I shall always regret is that I didn't kill him too. I could have done it without any extra trouble then. Now it's too late. Great nuisance. But he's useful sometimes. I hope you're not going to put all this down in your book." The off-hand, hard manner and the contemptuous tone of plain Mr. Jones disconcerted Schomberg utterly. He had never been spoken to like this in his life. He shook his head in silence and withdrew, not exactly scared, though he was in reality of a timid disposition under his manly exterior, but distinctly mystified and impressed. Chapter 5. 3 weeks later, after putting his cash-box away in the safe, which filled with its iron bulk a corner of their room, Schomberg turned towards his wife, but without looking at her exactly, and said, "I must get rid of these two. It won't do." Mrs. Schomberg had entertained that very opinion from the first, but she had been broken years ago into keeping her opinions to herself. Sitting in her night attire in the light of a single candle, she was careful not to make a sound, knowing from experience that her very assent would be resented. With her eyes she followed the figure of Schomberg, clad in his sleeping suit, and moved relentlessly about the room. He never glanced her way, for the reason that Mrs. Schomberg, in her night attire, looked the most unattractive object in existence. Miserable, insignificant, faded, crushed, old. And the contrast with the feminine form he had ever in his mind's eye made his wife's appearance painful to his aesthetic sense. Schomberg walked about swearing and fuming for the purpose of screwing his courage up to the sticking point. "Hang me if I ought not to go now, at once, this minute, into his bedroom, and tell him to be off. Him and that secretary of his, early in the morning. I don't mind a round game of cards, but to make a decoy of my table d'hote, my blood boils. He came here because some lying rascal in Manila told him I kept a table d'hote." He said these things, not for Mrs. Schomberg's information, but simply thinking aloud and trying to work his fury up to a point where it would give him courage enough to face plain Mr. Jones. "Impudent, overbearing, swindling sharper," he went on. "I have a good mind to—" He was beside himself in his lurid, heavy, Teutonic manner, so unlike the picturesque, lively rage of the Latin races. And though his eyes strayed about irresolutely, yet his swollen, angry features awakened in the miserable woman over whom he had been tyrannizing for years a fear for his precious carcass, since the poor creature had nothing else but that to hold on to in the world. She knew him well, but she did not know him altogether. The last thing a woman will consent to discover in a man whom she loves, or on whom she simply depends, is want of courage. And, timid in her corner, she ventured to say pressingly, "Be careful, Wilhelm. Remember the knives and revolvers in their trunks." In guise of thanks for that anxious reminder, he swore horribly in the direction of her shrinking person. In her scanty nightdress and barefooted, she recalled a medieval penitent being reproved for her sins in blasphemous terms. Those lethal weapons were always present to Schomberg's mind. Personally, he had never seen them. His part, 10 days after his guest's arrival, had been to lounge in manly, careless attitudes on the veranda, keeping watch, while Mrs. Schomberg, provided with a bunch of assorted keys, her discoloured teeth chattering and her globular eyes absolutely idiotic with fright, was going through the luggage of these strange clients. Her terrible Wilhelm had insisted on it. "I'll be on the lookout, I tell you," he said. "I shall give you a whistle when I see them coming back." "You couldn't whistle." "And if he were to catch you at it and chuck you out by the scruff of the neck, it wouldn't hurt you much. But he wouldn't touch a woman. Not he. He has told me so. Affected beast. I must find out something about their little game, and so there's an end of it. Go in, go now, quick march!" It had been an awful job, but she did go in, because she was much more afraid of Schomberg than of any possible consequence of the act. Her greatest concern was lest no key of the bunch he had provided her with should fit the locks. It would have been such a disappointment for Wilhelm. However, the trunk, she found, had been left open, but her investigation did not last long. She was frightened of firearms, and generally of all weapons, not from personal cowardice, as some women are, almost superstitiously, from an abstract horror of violence and murder. She was out again on the veranda long before Wilhelm had any occasion for a warning whistle. The instinctive, motiveless fear being the most difficult to overcome, nothing could induce her to return to her investigations, neither threatening growls, nor ferocious hisses, nor yet a poke or two in the ribs. "Stupid female," muttered the hotel-keeper, perturbed by the notion of that armoury in one of his bedrooms. This was from no abstract sentiment. With him it was constitutional. "Get out of my sight," he snarled. "Go and dress yourself for the table d'hôte." Left to himself, Schomberg had meditated. What the devil did this mean? His thinking processes were sluggish and spasmodic, but suddenly the truth came to him. "By heavens, they are desperadoes," he thought. Just then he beheld plain Mr. Jones and his secretary, with the ambiguous name of Ricardo, entering the grounds of the hotel. They had been down to the port on some business, and now were returning. Mr. Jones, lank, spare, opening his long legs with angular regularity like a pair of compasses, the others stepping out briskly by his side. Conviction entered Schomberg's heart. They were two desperadoes, no doubt about it. But as the funk which he experienced was merely a general sensation, he managed to put on his most severe officer of the reserve manner long before they had closed with him. "Good morning, gentlemen." Being answered with derisive civility, he became confirmed in his sudden conviction of their desperate character. The way Mr. Jones turned his hollow eyes on one, like an incurious spectre, and the way the other, when addressed, suddenly retracted his lips and exhibited his teeth without looking round, here was evidence enough to settle that point. Desperadoes! They passed through the billiard-room, inscrutably mysterious, to the back of the house, to join their violated trunks. "Tiffin bell will ring in 5 minutes, gentlemen," Schomberg called after them, exaggerating the deep manliness of his tone. He had managed to upset himself very much. He expected to see them come back infuriated and begin to bully him with an odious lack of restraint. Desperadoes! However, they didn't. They had not noticed anything unusual about their trunks, and Schomberg recovered his composure and said to himself that he must get rid of this deadly incubus as soon as practicable. They couldn't possibly want to stay very long. This was not the town, the colony, for desperate characters. He shrank from action. He dreaded any kind of disturbance, a fracas, as he called it in his hotel. Such things were not good for business. Of course, sometimes one had to have a fracas, but it had been a comparatively trifling task to seize the frail San Giacomo, whose bones were no larger than a chicken's, round the ribs, lift him up bodily, dash him to the ground, and fall on him. It had been easy. The wretched hook-nosed creature lay without movement, buried under its purple beard. Suddenly, remembering the occasion of that fracas, Schomberg groaned with the pain as of a hot coal under his breastbone, and gave himself up to desolation. Ah, if he had only that girl with him, he would have been masterful and resolute and fearless, fight 20 desperadoes, care for nobody on earth. Whereas the possession of Mrs. Schomberg was no incitement to a display of manly virtues. Instead of caring for no one, he felt that he cared for nothing. Life was a hollow sham. He wasn't going to risk a shot through his lungs or his liver in order to preserve its integrity. It had no savour, damn it. In his state of moral decomposition, Schomberg, master as he was of the art of hotel-keeping, and careful of giving no occasion for criticism to the powers regulating that branch of human activity, let things take their course, though he saw very well where that course was tending. It began first with a game or two after dinner, for the drinks, apparently, with some lingering customer, at one of the little tables ranged against the walls of the billiard-room. Schomberg detected the meaning of it at once. That's what it was. This is what they were. And moving about restlessly, at that time his morose silent period had set in, he cast sidelong looks at that game. But he said nothing. It was not worth while having a row with men who were so overbearing. Even when money appeared in connection with these postprandial games, into which more and more people were being drawn, he still refrained from raising the question. He was reluctant to draw unduly the attention of plain Mr. Jones and of the equivocal Ricardo to his person. One evening, however, after the public rooms of the hotel had become empty, Schomberg made an attempt to grapple with the problem in an indirect way. In a distant corner, the tired China boy dozed on his heels, his back against the wall. Mrs. Schomberg had disappeared, as usual, between 10 and 11. Schomberg walked about slowly in and out of the room and the veranda, thoughtful, waiting for his two guests to go to bed. Then suddenly he approached them, militarily, his chest thrown out, his voice curt and soldierly. "Hot night, gentlemen." Mr. Jones, lolling back idly in a chair, looked up. Ricardo, as idle but more upright, made no sign. "Won't you have a drink with me before retiring?" went on Schomberg, sitting down by the little table. "By all means," said Mr. Jones lazily. Ricardo showed his teeth in a strange, quick grin. Schomberg felt painfully how difficult it was to get in touch with these men, both so quiet, so deliberate, so menacingly unceremonious. He ordered the Chinaman to bring in the drinks. His purpose was to discover how long these guests intended to stay. Ricardo displayed no conversational vein, but Mr. Jones appeared communicative enough. His voice somehow matched his sunken eyes. It was hollow without being in the least mournful. It sounded distant, uninterested, as though he was speaking from the bottom of a well. Schomberg learnt that he would have the privilege of lodging and boarding these gentlemen for at least a month more. He could not conceal his discomfiture at this piece of news. "What's the matter? Don't you like to have people in your house?" asked plain Mr. Jones languidly. "I should have thought the owner of a hotel would be pleased." He lifted his delicate and beautifully pencilled eyebrows. Schomberg muttered something about the locality being dull and uninteresting to travellers. Nothing going on. Too quiet altogether. But he only provoked the declaration that quiet had its charm sometimes, and even dullness was welcome as a change. "We haven't had time to be dull for the last 3 years, added plain Mr. Jones, his eyes fixed darkly on Schomberg, whom he furthermore invited to have another drink, this time with him, and not to worry himself about things he didn't understand, and especially not to be inhospitable, which in a hotel keeper is highly unprofessional.
I don't understand, grumbled Schomburg. Oh, yes, I understand perfectly well.
You're frightened, interrupted Mr. Jones. What is the matter?
I don't want any scandal in my place. That's what's the matter.
Schomburg tried to face the situation bravely, but that steady black stare affected him. And when he glanced aside uncomfortably, he met Ricardo's grin uncovering a lot of teeth, though the man seemed absorbed in his thoughts all the time. And moreover, went on Mr. Jones in that distant tone of his, you can't help yourself. Here we are, and here we stay. Would you try to put us out?
I dare say you could do it.
But you couldn't do it without getting hurt. Very badly hurt. We can promise him that, can't we, Martin? The secretary retracted his lips and looked up sharply at Schomburg, as if only too anxious to leap upon him with teeth and claws. Schomburg managed to produce a deep laugh. Mr. Jones closed his eyes wearily, as if the light hurt them, and looked remarkably like a corpse for a moment. This was bad enough, but when he opened them again, it was almost a worse trial for Schomburg's nerves. The spectral intensity of that glance fixed on the hotel keeper, and this was the most frightful, without any definite expression, seemed to dissolve the last grain of resolution in his character. You don't think, by any chance, that you have to do with ordinary people, do you? Inquired Mr. Jones, in his lifeless manner, which seemed to imply some sort of menace from beyond the grave.
He's a gentleman,
testified Martin Ricardo, with a sudden snap of the lips, after which his moustaches stirred by themselves in an odd feline manner. Oh, I wasn't thinking of that, said plain Mr. Jones, while Schomburg, dumb and planted heavily in his chair, looked from one to the other, leaning forward a little. Of course I am that. But Ricardo attaches too much importance to a social advantage. What I mean, for instance, is that he, quiet and inoffensive as you see him sitting here, would think nothing of setting fire to this house of entertainment of yours. It would blaze like a box of matches. Think of that. It wouldn't advance your affairs much, would it? Whatever happened to us?
Come, come, gentlemen, remonstrated Schomburg in a murmur. This is very vile talk.
And you've been used to deal with tame people, haven't you? But we aren't tame. We once kept a whole angry town at bay for 2 days, and then we got away with our plunder. It was in Venezuela. Ask Martin here. He can tell you. Instinctively, Schomburg looked at Ricardo, who only passed the tip of his tongue over his lips with an uncanny sort of gusto, but did not offer to begin. Well, perhaps it would be a rather long story, Mr. Jones conceded after a short silence.
I have no desire to hear it, I am sure, said Schomburg. This isn't Venezuela. You wouldn't get away from here like that. But all this is silly talk of the worst sort. Do you mean to say you would make deadly trouble for the sake of a few guilders that you and that other, eyeing Ricardo suspiciously, as one would look at a strange animal, gentleman can win of an evening? Isn't as if my customers were a lot of rich men with pockets full of cash? I wonder you take so much trouble and risk for so little money.
Schomburg's argument was met by Mr. Jones's statement that one must do something to kill the time. Killing time was not forbidden. For the rest, being in a communicative mood, Mr. Jones said languidly in a voice indifferent, as if issuing from a tomb, that he depended on himself, as if the world were still one great wild jungle without law. Martin was something like that, too, for reasons of his own. All these statements Ricardo confirmed by short, inhuman grins. Schomburg lowered his eyes, for the sight of these two men intimidated him, but he was losing patience.
Of course, I could see at once that you were two desperate characters, something like what you say. But what would you think if I told you that I am pretty near as desperate as you two gentlemen? Here's that Schomburg has an easy time running his hotel, people think. And yet it seems to me I would just as soon let you rip me open and burn the whole show as not. There!"
A low whistle was heard. It came from Ricardo and was derisive. Schomburg, breathing heavily, looked on the floor. He was really desperate. Mr. Jones remained languidly sceptical. "Tut, tut. You have a tolerable business. You're perfectly tame. He paused, then added in a tone of disgust, "You have a wife." Schomburg tapped the floor angrily with his foot and uttered an indistinct, laughing curse.
"What do you mean by flinging that damned trouble at my head?" he cried. "I wish you would carry her off with you somewhere to the devil. I wouldn't run after you."
The unexpected outburst affected Mr. Jones strangely. He had a horrified recoil, chair and all, as if Schomburg had thrust a wriggling viper in his face.
"What's this infernal nonsense?" he muttered thickly.
"What do you mean?"
"How dare you?"
Ricardo chuckled audibly.
"I tell you, I am desperate," Schomburg repeated. "I am as desperate as any man ever was. I don't care a hang what happens to me."
"Well, then," Mr. Jones began to speak with a quietly threatening effect, as if the common words of daily use had some other deadly meaning to his mind. "Well, then, why should you make yourself ridiculously disagreeable to us? If you don't care, as you say, you might just as well let us have the key of that music shed of yours for a quiet game. A modest bank, a dozen candles or so. It would be greatly appreciated by your clients. As far as I can judge from the way they betted on a game of écarté I had with that fair baby-faced man. What's his name? They just yearn for a modest bank. And I'm afraid Martin here would take it badly if you objected. But of course he won't. Think of the calls for drinks." Schomburg, raising his eyes, at last met the gleams in two dark caverns under Mr. Jones's devilish eyebrows, directed upon him impenetrably. He shuddered, as if horrors worse than murder had been lurking there, and said, nodding towards Ricardo, "I dare say he wouldn't think twice about sticking me, if he had you at his back. I wish I had sunk my launch and gone to the bottom myself in her before I boarded the steamer you came by. Ah, well, I've been already living in hell for weeks, so you don't make much difference. I'll let you have the concert room, and hang the consequences. But what about the boy on late duty? If he sees the cards and actual money passing, he will be sure to blab, and it will be all over the town in no time." A ghastly smile stirred the lips of Mr. Jones. "Ah, I see you want to make a success of it. Very good. Well, that's the way to get on. Oh, don't let it disturb you. You chase all the Chinamen to bed early, and we'll get Pedro here every evening. He isn't the conventional waiter's cut, but he will do to run to and fro with the tray, while you sit here from 9 to 11, serving out drinks and gathering the money." "So there'll be 3 of them now," thought the unlucky Schomburg. But Pedro, at any rate, was just a simple, straightforward brute, if a murderous one. There was no mystery about him, nothing uncanny, no suggestion of a stealthy, deliberate wildcat turned into a man, or of an insolent spectre on leave from Hades, endowed with skin and bones and a subtle power of terror. Pedro, with his fangs, his tangled beard, and queer stare of his little bear's eyes, was, by comparison, delightfully natural. Besides, Schomburg could no longer help himself. "That will do very well," he asserted mournfully. "But if you had turned up here only 3 months ago, aye, less than 3 months ago, you would have found somebody very different from what I am now to talk to you. It's true. What do you think of that?" "I scarcely know what to think. I should think it was a lie. You were probably as tame 3 months ago as you are now. You were born tame, like most people in the world." Mr. Jones got up spectrally, and Ricardo imitated him with a snarl and a stretch. Schomburg, in a brown study, went on, as if to himself, "There has been an orchestra here, 18 women." Mr. Jones let out an exclamation of dismay, and looked about as if the walls around him and the whole house had been infected with plague. Then he became very angry, and swore violently at Schomberg for daring to bring up such subjects. The hotel keeper was much too surprised to get up. He gazed from his chair at Mr. Jones's anger, which had nothing spectral in it, but was not the more comprehensible for that. What's the matter?" he stammered out. "What subject? Didn't you hear me say it was an orchestra? There's nothing wrong in that." "Well, there was a girl amongst them." Schomberg's eyes went stony. He clasped his hands in front of his breast with such force that his knuckles came out white. "Such a girl! Tame, am I? I would have kicked everything to pieces about me for her. And she, of course. I'm in the prime of life. Then a fellow bewitched her. A vagabond, a false, lying, swindling, underhand, stick-at-nothing brute. Ugh!" His entwined fingers cracked as he tore his hands apart, flung out his arms, and leaned his forehead on them in a passion of fury. The other two looked at his shaking back, the attenuated Mr. Jones with mingled scorn and a sort of fear, Ricardo with the expression of a cat which sees a piece of fish in the pantry out of reach. Schomberg flung himself backwards. He was dry-eyed, but he gulped as if swallowing sobs. "No wonder you can do with me what you like. You have no idea. Just let me tell you of my trouble." "I don't want to know anything of your beastly trouble," said Mr. Jones, in his most lifelessly positive voice. He stretched forth an arresting hand, and as Schomberg remained open-mouthed, he walked out of the billiard-room in all the uncanniness of his thinked shanks. Ricardo followed at his leader's heels, but he showed his teeth to Schomberg over his shoulder. Chapter 6. From that evening dated those mysterious but significant phenomena in Schomberg's establishment which attracted Captain Davidson's casual notice when he dropped in, placid yet astute, in order to return Mrs. Schomberg's Indian shawl. And strangely enough, they lasted some considerable time. It argued either honesty and bad luck or extraordinary restraint on the part of plain Mr. Jones and Co. in their discreet operations with cards. It was a curious and impressive sight, the inside of Schomberg's concert hall, encumbered at one end by a great stack of chairs piled up on and about the musicians' platform, and lighted at the other by 24 candles disposed about a long trestle table covered with green cloth. In the middle, Mr. Jones, a starved spectre turned into a banker, faced Ricardo, a rather nasty, slow-moving cat turned into a croupier. By contrast, the other faces round that table, anything between 20 and 30, must have looked like collected samples of intensely artless, helpless humanity, pathetic in their innocent watch for the small turns of luck, which indeed might have been serious enough for them. They had no notice to spare for the hairy Pedro, carrying a tray with the clumsiness of a creature caught in the woods and taught to walk on its hind legs. As to Schomberg, he kept out of the way. He remained in the billiard-room, serving out drinks to the unspeakable Pedro with an air of not seeing the growling monster, of not knowing where the drinks went, of ignoring that there was such a thing as a music-room over there under the trees within 50 yards of the hotel. He submitted himself to the situation with a low-spirited stoicism, compounded of fear and resignation. Directly the party had broken up, he could see dark shapes of the men drifting singly and in knots through the gate of the compound. He would withdraw out of sight behind a door not quite closed, in order to avoid meeting his two extraordinary guests. But he would watch through the crack their contrasted forms pass through the billiard-room, and disappear on their way to bed. Then he would hear doors being slammed upstairs, and a profound silence would fall upon the whole house, upon his hotel appropriated, haunted by those insolently outspoken men, provided with a whole armoury of weapons in their trunks. A profound silence. Schomberg sometimes could not resist the notion that he must be dreaming. Shuddering, he would pull himself together and creep out with movements strangely inappropriate to the lieutenant of the reserve bearing by which he tried to keep up his self-respect before the world. A great loneliness oppressed him. One after another he would extinguish the lamps and move softly towards his bedroom, where Mrs. Schomberg waited for him. No fit companion for a man of his ability, and in the prime of life. But that life, alas, was blighted. He felt it, and never with such force as when on opening the door he perceived that woman sitting patiently in a chair, her toes peeping out under the edge of her nightdress, an amazingly small amount of hair on her head drooping on the long stalk of scraggy neck, with that everlasting scared grin showing a blue tooth and meaning nothing, not even real fear. For she was used to him. Sometimes he was tempted to screw the head off the stalk. He imagined himself doing it, with one hand, a twisting movement. Not seriously, of course. Just a simple indulgence for his exasperated feelings. He wasn't capable of murder. He was certain of that. And remembering suddenly the plain speeches of Mr. Jones, he would think, I suppose I am too tame for that. Quite unaware that he had murdered the poor woman morally years ago. He was too unintelligent to have the notion of such a crime. Her bodily presence was bitterly offensive, because of its contrast with a very different feminine image. And it was no use getting rid of her. She was a habit of years, and there would be nothing to put in her place. At any rate, he could talk to that idiot half the night if he chose. That night he had been vapouring before her as to his intention to face his two guests, and instead of that inspiration he needed, had merely received the usual warning, Be careful, Wilhelm. He did not want to be told to be careful by an imbecile female. What he needed was a pair of woman's arms which, flung around his neck, would brace him up for the encounter. Inspire him, he called it to himself. He lay awake a long time, and his slumbers, when they came, were unsatisfactory and short. The morning light had no joy for his eyes. He listened dismally to the movements in the house. The Chinamen were unlocking and flinging wide the doors of the public rooms, which opened on the veranda. Horrors! Another poisoned day to get through somehow. The recollection of his resolve made him feel actually sick for a moment. First of all, the lordly, abandoned attitude of Mr. Jones disconcerted him. Then there was his contemptuous silence. Mr. Jones never addressed himself to Schomberg with any general remarks, never opened his lips to him unless to say, Good morning. Two simple words which, uttered by that man, seemed a mockery of a threatening character. And lastly, it was not a frank physical fear he inspired, for as to that even a cornered rat will fight, but a superstitious shrinking awe, something like an invincible repugnance to seek speech with a wicked ghost. That it was a daylight ghost, surprisingly angular in his attitudes, and for the most part spread out on 3 chairs, did not make it any easier. Daylight only made him a more weird and more disturbing and unlawful apparition. Strangely enough, in the evening, when he came out of his mute supineness, this unearthly side of him was less obtrusive. At the gaming table, when actually handling the cards, it was probably sunk quite out of sight. But Schomberg, having made up his mind in ostrich-like fashion to ignore what was going on, never entered the desecrated music-room. He had never seen Mr. Jones in the exercise of his vocation, or perhaps it was only his trade. I will speak to him tonight, Schomberg said to himself, while he drank his morning tea, in pyjamas on the veranda, before the rising sun had topped the trees of the compound, and while the undried dews still lay silvery on the grass, sparked on the blossoms of the central flower-bed, and darkened the yellow gravel of the drive. That's what I'll do. I won't keep out of sight tonight. I shall come out and catch him as he goes to bed, carrying the catch-box. After all, what was the fellow but a common desperado? Murderous? Oh, yes. Murderous enough, perhaps. And the muscles of Schomberg's stomach had a quivering contraction under his airy attire. But even a common desperado would think twice, or more likely 100 times, before openly murdering an inoffensive citizen in a civilized European-ruled town. He jerked his shoulders. Of course. He shuddered again, and paddled back to his room to dress himself. His mind was made up, and he would think no more about it. Still he had his doubts. They grew and unfolded themselves with the progress of the day, as some plants do. At times they made him perspire more than usual, and they did away with the possibility of his afternoon siesta. After turning over on his couch more than a dozen times, he gave up this mockery of repose, got up, and went downstairs. It was between 3 and 4 o'clock, the hour of profound peace. The very flowers seemed to doze on their stalks, set with sleepy leaves. Not even the air stirred, for the sea breeze was not due till later. The servants were out of sight, catching naps in the shade somewhere behind the house. Mrs. Schomberg, in a dim upstairs room with closed jalousie, was elaborating those 2 long pendant ringlets which was such a feature of her hairdressing for her afternoon duties. At that time no customers ever troubled the repose of the establishment. Wandering about his premises in profound solitude, Schomberg recoiled at the door of the billiard-room as if he had seen a snake in his path. All alone at the billiards, the bare little tables, and a lot of untenanted chairs, Mr. Secretary Ricardo sat near the wall, performing with lightning rapidity something that looked like tricks with his own personal pack of cards, which he always carried about in his pocket. Schomberg would have backed out quietly if Ricardo had not turned his head. Having been seen, the hotel-keeper elected to walk in as the lesser risk of the two. The consciousness of his inwardly abject attitude towards these men caused him always to throw his chest out and assume a severe expression. Ricardo watched his approach, clasping the pack of cards in both hands. "You want something, perhaps?" suggested Schomberg, in his lieutenant of the reserve voice. Ricardo shook his head in silence and looked expectant. With him, Schomberg exchanged at least 20 words every day. He was infinitely more communicative than his patron. At times he looked very much like an ordinary human being of his class, and he seemed to be in an amiable mood at that moment. Suddenly spreading some 10 cards face downwards in the form of a fan, he thrust them towards Schomberg. "Come, man, take one, quick!" Schomberg was so surprised that he took one hurriedly after a very perceptible start. The eyes of Martin Ricardo gleamed phosphorescent in the half-light of the room, screened from the heat and glare of the tropics. "That's a king of hearts you've got," he chuckled, showing his teeth in a quick flash. Schomberg, after looking at the card, admitted that it was, and laid it down on the table. "I can make you take any card I like, 9 times out of 10, exulted the secretary, with a strange curl of his lips, and a green flicker in his raised eyes. Schomberg looked down at him dumbly. For a few seconds neither of them stirred. Then Ricardo lowered his glance, and opening his fingers, let the whole pack fall on the table. Schomberg sat down. He sat down because of the faintness in his legs, and for no other reason. His mouth was dry. Having sat down, he felt that he must speak. He squared his shoulders in parade style. "You are pretty good at that sort of thing," he said. "Practice makes perfect," replied the secretary. His precarious amiability made it impossible for Schomberg to get away. Thus, from his very timidity, the hotel-keeper found himself engaged in a conversation the thought of which filled him with apprehension. It must be said, in justice to Schomberg, that he concealed his funk very creditably. A habit of throwing out his chest and speaking in severe voice stood him in good stead. With him, too, practice made perfect, and he would probably have kept it up to the end, to the very last moment, to the ultimate instant of breaking strain which would leave him grovelling on the floor. To add to his secret trouble, he was at a loss what to say. He found nothing else but the remark, "I suppose you are fond of cards?" "What would you expect?" asked Ricardo in a simple philosophical tone. "It is likely. Should I not be?" Then with sudden fire, "Fond of cards? Aye, passionately." The effect of this outburst was augmented by the quiet lowering of the eyelids, by a reserved pause as though this had been a confession of another kind of love. Schomberg cudgelled his brains for a new topic, but he could not find one. His usual scandalous gossip would not serve this turn. That desperado did not know anyone anywhere within 1,000 miles. Schomberg was almost compelled to keep to the subject. "I suppose you've always been so, from your early youth?" Ricardo's eyes remained cast down. His fingers toyed absently with the pack on the table. "I don't know that it was so early. I first got in the way of it playing for tobacco. In forecastles of ships, you know. Common sailor games. We used to spend our watches below at it round a chest under a slush lamp. We would hardly spare the time to get a bite of salt horse, neither eat nor sleep. We could hardly stand where the watches were mustered on deck. Talk of gambling!" He dropped the reminiscent tone to add the information. "I was bred to the sea from a boy, you know." Schomberg had fallen into a reverie, but without losing the sense of impending calamity. The next words he heard were, "I got on all right at sea, too. Worked up to be mate. I was mate of a schooner, a yacht you might call her. A special good berth, too, in the Gulf of Mexico.
A soft job that you don't often run across more than once in a lifetime. Yes, I was mate of her when I left the sea to follow him."
Ricardo tossed up his chin to indicate the room above, from which Schomberg, his wits painfully aroused by this reminder of Mr. Jones's existence, concluded that the latter had withdrawn into his bedroom. Ricardo, observing him from under lowered eyelids, went on,
"It so happened that we were shipmates." "Mr. Jones, you mean? Is he a sailor too?"
Ricardo raised his eyelids at that.
"He's no more Mr. Jones than you are," he said, with obvious pride. "He? A sailor? That just shows your ignorance. But there, a foreigner can't be expected to know any better. I am an Englishman, and I know a gentleman at sight. I should know one drunk, in the gutter, in jail, under the gallows. There's a something. It isn't exactly the appearance, it's a... no use trying to tell you. You ain't an Englishman, and if you were, you wouldn't need to be told."
An unsuspected stream of loquacity had broken its dam somewhere deep within the man, had diluted his fiery blood, and softened his pitiless fibre. Schomberg experienced mingled relief and apprehension, as if suddenly an enormous savage cat had begun to wind itself about his legs in inexplicable friendliness. No prudent man under such circumstances would dare to stir. Schomberg didn't stir. Ricardo assumed an easy attitude, with an elbow on the table. Schomberg squared his shoulders afresh.
"I was employed in that there yacht, schooner, whatever you call it, by 10 gentlemen at once." "That surprises you, eh?" Yes, 10. Leastwise, there were 9 of them gents good enough in their way, and one downright gentleman, and that was—"
Ricardo gave another upward jerk of his chin, as much to say, "He, the only one."
"And no mistake," he went on. "I spotted him from the first day."
"How? Why?"
"Ah, you may ask. Ain't seen that many gentlemen in my life. Well, somehow I did. If you were an Englishman, you would— What was your yacht?"
Schomberg interrupted as impatiently as he dared, for this harping on nationality jarred on his already tried nerves. What was the game?
"You haven't had peace on you. Game, exactly. That's what it was. The sort of silliness gentlemen will get up amongst themselves to play at adventure. A treasure-hunting expedition. Each of them put down so much money, you understand, to buy the schooner. Their agent in the city engaged me and the skipper. The greatest secrecy and all that. I reckon he had a twinkle in his eye all the time, and no mistake. But that wasn't our business. Let them bust their money as they like. The pity of it was that so little of it came our way. Just fair pay and no more. And damn any pay, much or little anyhow. That's what I say."
He blinked his eyes greenishly in the dim light. The heat seemed to have stilled everything in the world but his voice. He swore at large, abundantly, in snarling undertones. It was impossible to say why, then calmed down as inexplicably, and went on as a sailor yarns.
"At first there were only 9 of them adventurous sparks. Then, just a day or 2 before the sailing date, he turned up. Heard of it somehow, somewhere. I would say from some woman, if I didn't know him as I do. He would give any woman a 10-mile berth. He can't stand 'em. Or maybe in a flash bar, or maybe in one of them grand clubs in Pall Mall. Anyway, the agents netted him in all right. Cash down and only about 24 hours for him to get ready. But he didn't miss his ship. Not he. You might have called it a pier-head jump, for a gentleman. I saw him come along. Know the West India Docks, eh?"
Schomberg did not know the West India Docks. Ricardo looked at him pensively for a while, and then continued, as if such ignorance had to be disregarded.
"Our tug was already alongside. 2 loafers were carrying his dunnage behind him. I told the dockman at our moorings to keep all fast for a minute. The gangway was down already, but he made nothing of it. Up he jumps, one leap, swings his long legs over the railing, and there he is on board. They pass up his swell dunnage, and he puts his hand in his trouser pocket and throws all his small change on the wharf for them chaps to pick up. They were still promenading that wharf on all fours when we cast off. It was only then that he looked at me, quietly, you know, in a slow way. He wasn't so thin then as he is now, but I noticed he wasn't so young as he looked, not by a long chalk. He seemed to touch me inside somewhere. I went away pretty quick from there. I was wanted forward anyhow. I wasn't frightened. What should I be frightened for? I only felt touched on the very spot. But gee, Minnie, if anybody told me we should be partners before the year was out, well, I would have...
He swore a variety of strange oaths, some common, others quaintly horrible to Schomberg's ears, and all mere innocent exclamations of wonder at the shifts and changes of human fortune. Schomberg moved slightly in his chair, but the admirer and partner of plain Mr. Jones seemed to have forgotten Schomberg's existence for the moment. The stream of ingenious blasphemy, some of it in bad Spanish, had run dry, and Martin Ricardo, connoisseur and gentleman, sat dumb with a stony gaze, as if still marvelling inwardly at the amazing elections, conjunctions, and associations of events which influence man's pilgrimage on this earth. At last Schomberg spoke tentatively.
"And so the gentleman up there talked you into leaving a good berth?"
Ricardo started.
"Talk me over? Didn't need to talk me over. Just beckoned to me, and that was enough. By that time we were in the Gulf of Mexico. One night we were lying at anchor, close to a dry sandbank. To this day I'm not sure where it was, off the Colombian coast or thereabouts. We were to start digging the next morning, and all the hands had turned in early, expecting a hard day with the shovels. Up he comes, and in his quiet, tired way of speaking, you can tell a gentleman by that as much as by anything else almost. Up he comes behind me and says, just like that, into my ear in a manner, 'Well, what do you think of our treasure hunt now?' I didn't even turn my head. Exactly as I stood I remained, and I spoke no louder than himself. 'If you want to know, sir, it's nothing but just damned tomfoolery.' We had, of course, been having short talks together at one time or another during the passage. I dare say he'd read me like a book. There ain't much to me, except that I've never been tame, even when walking the pavement and cracking jokes and standing drinks to chums, aye, and to strangers too. I watch 'em lifting their elbows at my expense, or splitting their side at my fun. I could be funny when I like, you bet."
A pause for self-complacent contemplation of his own fun and generosity checked the flow of Ricardo's speech. Schomberg was concerned to keep within bounds the enlargement of his eyes, which he seemed to feel growing bigger in his head.
Yes, he whispered hastily. "I would watch 'em and think, 'You boys don't know who I am.' If you did. With girls, too. Once I was courting a girl. I used to kiss her behind the ear and say to myself, 'If you only knew who's kissing you, my dear, you'd scream and bolt.' Not that I wanted to do 'em any harm, but I felt a power in myself. Now, here we sit, friendly like, and that's all right. You are in my way, but I'm not friendly to you. I just don't care. Some men do say that, but I really don't. You know more to me on one way or another than that fly there. Just so. I'd squash you or leave you alone. I don't care what I do."
If real force of character consists in overcoming our sudden weaknesses, Schomberg displayed plenty of that quality. At the mention of the fly, he reinforced the severe dignity of his attitude, as one inflates a collapsing toy balloon with a great effort of breath. The easy-going, relaxed attitude of Ricardo was really appalling.
"That's so," he went on. "I am that sort of fellow. You wouldn't think it, would you? No. You have to be told. So I'm telling you. And I dare say you only half believe it. But you can't say to yourself that I'm drunk. Stare at me as you may. I haven't had anything stronger than a glass of iced water all day. Takes a real gentleman to see through a fellow. Oh, yes, he spotted me. I told you we had a few talks at sea about one thing or another, and I used to watch him down the skylight, playing cards in the cuddy with the others. They had to pass the time away somehow. But the same token, he caught me at it once, and it was then that I told him I was fond of cards, and generally lucky in gambling too. Yes, he'd sized me up. Why not? A gentleman's just like any other man. And something more."
It flashed through Schomberg's mind that these two were indeed well matched in their enormous dissimilarity, identical souls in different disguises.
"Says he to me," Ricardo started again in a gossiping manner, "'I'm packed up.
It's about time to go, Martin. It was the first time he called me Martin. Says I, is that it, sir? You didn't think that I was after that sort of treasure, did you? I wanted to clear out from home quietly. It's a pretty expensive way of getting a passage across, but it has served my turn. I let him know very soon that I was game for anything, from pitch and toss to wilful murder in his company. Wilful murder? Says he, in his quiet way. What the deuce is that? What are you talking about? People do get killed sometimes when they get in one's way, but that's self-defence, you understand? I told him I did, and then I said I would run below for a minute to ram a few of my things into a sailor's bag I had. I've never cared for a lot of dunnage. I believed in going about flying light when I was at sea. I came back and found him strolling up and down the deck, as if he were taking a breath of fresh air before turning in, like any other evening. Ready? Yes, sir. He didn't even look at me. We had had a boat in the water astern ever since we came to anchor in the afternoon. He throws the stump of his cigar overboard. Can you get the captain out on deck? He asks. That was the last thing in the world I should have thought of doing. I lost my tongue for a moment. Well, I can try, says I. Well then, I'm going below. You get him up and keep him with you till I come back on deck. Mind, don't let him go below till I return. I could not help asking why he told me to rouse a sleeping man when we wanted everybody on board to sleep sweetly till we got clear of the schooner. He laughs a little and says that I didn't see all the bearings of this business. Mind, he says, don't let him leave you till you see me come up again. He puts his eyes close to mine. Keep him with you at all costs. And that means, says I, all costs to him, by every possible or impossible means. I don't want to be interrupted in my business down below. He would give me lots of trouble. I take you with me to save myself trouble in various circumstances, and you've got to enter on your work right away. Just so, sir, says I, and he slips down the companion. With a gentleman, you know at once where you are, but it was a ticklish job. The skipper was nothing to me one way or another, any more than you are at this moment, Mr. Schomburg. You may light your cigar or blow your brains out this minute, and I don't care a hang which you do, both or neither. To bring the skipper up was easy enough. I only had to stamp on the deck a few times over his head. I stamped hard. But how to keep him up when he got there? Anything the matter, Mr. Ricardo? I heard his voice behind me. There he was, and I hadn't thought of anything to say to him, so I didn't turn round. The moonlight was brighter than many a day I could remember in the North Sea. Why did you call me? Why are you staring out there, Mr. Ricardo? He was deceived by my keeping my back to him. I wasn't staring at anything, but his mistake gave me a notion. I am staring at something that looks like a canoe over there, I said very slowly. The skipper got concerned at once. It wasn't any danger from the inhabitants, whoever they were. Oh, hang it, says he, that's very unfortunate. He had hoped that the schooner being on the coast would not get known so very soon. Dashed awkward with the business we've got in hand to have a lot of natives watching operations. But you certain this is a canoe? It may be a drift log, I said, but I thought you'd better have a look with your own eyes. You may make it out better than I can. His eyes weren't anything like as good as mine, but he says, certainly, you did quite right. And it's a fact I had seen some drift logs at sunset. I saw what they were then and didn't trouble me head about them. Forgot all about it till that very moment. Nothing strange in seeing drift logs off a coast like that. And I'm hanged if the skipper didn't make one out in the wake of the moon. Strange what a little thing a man's life hangs on sometimes. A single word. Here you are, sitting unsuspicious before me, and you may let out something unbeknown to you that would settle your ash. Not that I have any ill feeling. I have no feelings. If the skipper had said, "Oh, bosh," and had turned his back on me, he would not have gone 3 steps towards his bed. But he stood there and stared. And now the job was to get him off the deck when he was no longer wanted there. We're just trying to make out if that object there is a canoe or a log, he says to Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones had come up, lounging as carelessly as when he went below. While the skipper was jawing about boats and drifting logs, I asked by signs from behind if I hadn't better knock him on the head and drop him quietly overboard. The night was slipping by and we had to go. It couldn't be put off till next night, no more. No more. And do you know why? Schomburg made a slight negative sign with his head. This direct appeal annoyed him, jarred on the induced quietude of a great talker forced into the part of a listener and sunk in it as a man sinks into slumber. Mr. Ricardo struck a note of scorn. Don't know why? Can't you guess? No? Because the boss had got hold of the skipper's cash box by then. See?